Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. It has been a week here in the United States and in my personal life too. Sometimes here on BookTube, I talk about what is going on in the world or in my life beyond books and reading. But today, I think I just want to answer a distracting tag. I think I'll title this video the Nonfiction Book Tag, but technically, originally, its name is actually the Nonfiction November Book Tag, created by Julie at the channel Book Travels, and honoring the month created by Olive at a Book Olive a decade ago or more, where BookTube spends the month celebrating the reading of nonfiction. Although the particular month is now long past, my love of nonfiction is not. Let's get straight to the questions. Number 1, what motivated you to pick up your first nonfiction book, and can you remember what it was? The first nonfiction book I remember picking out myself was a long biography of Helen Keller, written for children. In my take on the BookTube newbie tag years ago when I started this channel, I talked about my experience checking the volume out from my elementary school library and what it meant to me. I'll link to that story, but today I'll tell you about what happened next. It wasn't long before I discovered Nancy Drew and the Bobbsey twins and some similar mystery series aimed at children, some of which my mother and even her mother had read as children. My father encouraged me to read anything I liked, but he also really encouraged me to branch out from Nancy Drew a bit. He was an historian, and he found some way to talk me into trying a work of nonfiction again. I'm sure he reminded me of how much I had enjoyed the Helen Keller biography. I might have just been grappling with the fact that I had pretty much read all the fiction in my school's tiny library. Maybe he bribed me with the promise of a new store-bought Nancy Drew. I don't remember. But he suggested that I might start with another biography. My class went every week to check out books, and on that particular day, I pored through a tall case that contained a couple of large series of biographies. One was about the childhoods of American presidents, and I eventually made my way through most of those. But what grabbed me that first day was all the biographies of composers and their childhoods. I was a young pianist, and I was utterly charmed by a book about Haydn and his very early years. In my memory, there was a scene in this bio where one student dipped another student's ponytail in the jar of ink on his desk. I've never remembered if Haydn was the one doing the dipping or the one whose ponytail was dipped in the ink. In fact, for years, I've wondered if that story was really about Haydn, or if my memory has just combined a story I read in another children's biography, of Paul Revere or whatever. Well, I fell in love with biographies that year, and while I certainly didn't give up on Nancy Drew and her Roadster, nonfiction became a regular component of my library stack, and very much still is. The second question, how do you choose your next nonfiction read? Really 2 ways. One is that the vast majority of books I review formally, meaning books I write about and publish in online or print venues, are nonfiction. And many of those are biography. I follow the forthcoming offerings for nonfiction that come up on NetGalley, or that I hear about otherwise, and I read the ones that interest me, especially biographies of literary figures or composers and musicians or visual artists. As an academic historian, I also read a fair bit of history, especially social history, which I'll talk about a lot more in a different video. The other way I choose nonfiction is when I'm immersed in a little reading project of some sort. Perhaps I'm obsessed with a transcendentalist in 19th century New England. That's been my latest obsession. Or about the Harlem Renaissance in the early 20th century, or about the Dust Bowl, which I've talked about before, during a similar time but very different place in the U.S. And when I get on a subject kick like that, I'll often read multiple books, fiction and nonfiction, about the topic, or by and about a particular author, etc. Question 3. Do you take notes or annotate your nonfiction books? Oh, yes. If I'm reading a book for personal pleasure, I tend to mark passages that really resonate with me personally. Or I ask questions in the margin when I get curious about something or strongly disagree, or when I want to make a connection to the ideas of another book. If I'm reading a book because I'm going to review it for publication, I tend to do some of that, but also mark issues that I might want to focus on when I write the review, and mark some particularly telling lines that I might want to quote in order to share with readers some sense of the author's voice. Number 4, have you read a nonfiction book that's challenged your beliefs or assumptions? My first answer was going to be definitely, but actually I'm not sure. I suppose it depends on what challenged means. When I have deep-seated beliefs about the world, I love to read things that contradict those beliefs. I can't actually think of any situation where I've given up my own beliefs, but authors who argue something very different from my take often help me refine my own thoughts. Even if I totally disagree with them, I start thinking about how to talk about the distinctions in our beliefs more effectively. And more often, the differences just lead to more nuance in my own thought. I'll give a couple of examples of things that might be considered challenges. I'm a secular person, not a believer at all, but I still feel connected to many Jewish rituals and ideas. I read a lot about Jewish thought and practice, about the variety of styles of biblical interpretation, about Orthodox and progressive ways of celebrating holidays, about how Jews who are trans celebrate life cycle events, etc. Many of those works are designed for followers and believers, but that isn't how I read them. Usually I'm fascinated by what is meaningful to other people, even if it isn't to me personally. But there are definitely times when I read about something that will hit me personally, even if I don't expect it. Is it challenging when you don't change your own perspective, but do start to understand other people's perspectives more fully? Is it challenging if a book allows you to expand what you do, even if it is in a very small way? Another kind of challenge to assumptions is when I know very little about something. Not too long ago, I talked about my experience of reading a book about evangelical, charismatic Christianity, its history, and also how segments of the movement have become entangled with pro-MAGA politics. I had always been confused how some evangelicals did not seem bothered by some of Trump's actions. And I'm not talking about his politics, per se, but his various associations and behaviors with women, etc. The book I read was The Violent Ticket by Force by Matthew Taylor, which totally opened my eyes to something so different from anything I knew before. I hesitate to say his book challenged me, since I knew my assumptions were based on almost no knowledge, but he definitely shaped my understanding in a profound way. Okay, the next question is interesting. How do you feel about the intersection of storytelling and factual content in nonfiction? I love the place where the two are not just intersecting, but are literally one. That is, when an author lays out factual content in a well-told narrative. That is, of course, very common in history and biography. As my introduction to nonfiction answer might suggest, what I was looking for as a young reader, and continue to read for now, is a narrative where I get to see characters, real or made up, experience events, and think through who they are and how they're constantly shaped by the world around them. It's that I care about as a reader, and what I care about as a writer of nonfiction too, in my academic books and in the memoir I'm very unsuccessfully trying to write right now. I can't think of an example of a book of nonfiction that incorporates clearly fictional storytelling in it. But I did just read a novel that incorporates the idea of academic historical storytelling in it, and I found it to be fascinating. The book pretends to be an oral history done by two academics looking back on a period of significant social change. And that period of social change is fictional, happening in what would be our future. I'll leave a link to my discussion. The book was really interesting, although I think it was interesting because of the genre issues it raises, far more than the actual story it tells. Question 6. Is there a topic you wish authors would explore? I think about this question an awful lot, all the time maybe. Right now, I'm wanting to read a serious but non-academic study of white Southerners who participated in the civil rights movement. That is the specific topic in my head, partly because it's a world I know well. Both my parents were products of generations of white Southerners, and both of them chose, without the support of their families, to become very active in the fight for racial equality in their state and region. But fundamentally, this specific topic reflects a larger question. What makes it possible for people to go against their own immediate family, sometimes even their lives, in a fight for justice for the larger community? How do privileged people get to a place where we're not fighting for our own privileges, but willing to step out of our comfort zones and to take real risks in service of a better world for everyone? That big issue is always important, and maybe never more than it is right now. Number 7, do you incorporate insights from nonfiction into your daily life? Yes, and insights from fiction too, actually. Sometimes the insights are small and practical, and sometimes they are wildly expansive. I won't go deep into this, but after my husband died and I was reading about how people made it through the hardest parts of grief, really basic insights made an absolutely enormous difference to me. For example, go out in the sunshine and take a walk, alone, somewhere that isn't completely paved. And then do the same thing when you're not alone, when you're with friends. And can I suggest that those two pieces of advice are pretty good advice for everyone, even if you're not going through the death of a loved one? And the final question, choose just one book from your nonfiction collection to highlight. I'm going to hold up a relatively recent find from a used bookstore that I haven't read yet. The author is Jean Strauss, who has just recently published a new book that I think I might read for the reading event Framed in September, when we read about art. That new book is Family Romance, John Singer Sargent and the Wertheimers. It's been getting great reviews from some of my favorite critics and friends. But the book I want to highlight today is a much older book of hers, a biography, Alice James, The Life of the Brilliant Young Sister of William and Henry James. I'll be getting to this one relatively soon, I think. The book was first published in 1980 and won a major award in academic history while also receiving wonderful reviews in the more general bookish world. Let me read you what the beloved critic John Leonard says. Miss Strauss, in acquainting us with the younger sister of William and Henry James, has written a Jamesian novel. Subtle, evasive, embroidered, splendid. All right, that will do it for Tag Tuesday this week. Thank you all for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.